Bethesda's latest foray into the Fallout universe is something a little different than what we're used to. In an attempt to learn something new and try something different, Fallout 76 became a multiplayer experience, and as such, many things that one would expect from a traditional Fallout game have changed. You start off the game by leaving Vault 76 to help rebuild the great state of West Virginia, and you follow in the footsteps of your Vault Overseer to find out how best to do so. While following her trail, you end up getting involved with the remnants of many different factions that had cropped up since the fall of the bombs, like the Responders, who were a volunteer group attempting to create order and help out survivors, or the Free States, which were a group of people who wanted to cut themselves off from the government and lived in cement bunkers far from society, or the Cutthroats, a group of raiders living in an abandoned ski lodge. The overarching story that involves all these factions isn't exceptional by any means. It often feels like the story exists simply to encourage you to explore the vast Appalachian hills. And the factions themselves are often more interesting outside of the main story as you learn about them through notes, recordings, and a little bit of critical thinking. Take Rose, the maniacal mechanical raider bot who was reprogrammed to imitate a raider leader's girlfriend after she was killed. Or the history as to why and how the Brotherhood of Steel was in West Virginia. And it's not just the faction's history. All the history of this region is learned through similar means of notes and recordings, since this time around, the entirety of the state is completely devoid of people, making any sort of conversational learning non-existent. The reason for this wasn't to fulfill some intricate part of Fallout lore, though reasons for it are given, but rather to make the multiplayer portion of the game more impactful. In a traditional Fallout game, you would have had plenty of people to talk to and interact with through the use of the dialogue system. But that has been removed, along with all the people, so that those interactions could be done instead by actual players. It's not like this is a terrible idea. Random encounters with players can be just as interesting as scripted conversations, but I feel like Bethesda expects too much out of the average player. In my 40-ish hours of playtime, I've barely seen anyone after moving out of the starter area, and the few times I have encountered someone completely by chance, there's an exchange of waves, then we each go back to our own business. Like we're each playing our own single-player game, but other people just happen to be there. That's not to say the more scripted encounters aren't fun. I'm happy to join in on an event to help someone out, and since people with criminal bounties can't look at other players' locations, it's fun to stalk and hunt them from the shadows, like this player, who decided to surround himself with turrets to survive long enough that his bounty would expire, then made the mistake of coming out into the open. But even then, these seem more like fun side activities than they do major parts of the game. Speaking of side activities, most of the non-main quests don't really improve upon the quests of Fallout 4. You still end up hunting creatures in certain locations or tracking down items for delivery and other just as tedious tasks. Most of the daily quests and event quests end up having more interesting objectives like wave defense modes or even playing carnival games for a bunch of robots, but often suffer by occurring in the exact same way in the exact same place every single time. Quests aside, the combat in this game is almost an exact copy of the way it functioned in Fallout 4, along with most of the weapons and armor too. Though that's not to say they didn't add an array of new things to play around with. Alongside these come new loot changes, like being able to find plans to build weapons and armor from scratch, and needing to scrap the completed items to acquire modifications for them, as well as the items having different levels of power, which in turn require you to be at higher levels to use. Power armor also returns, and is still overpowered like I mentioned in my Fallout 4 video, but comes with more limitations, like fusion cores all having weight, so only a certain number of them can be held at once, repair costs being much more significant, and the really good pieces and upgrades being incredibly hard to acquire and have high level requirements to wear. And VATS makes a different appearance, as the real-time nature of a multiplayer game means there's no more time slow. As such, you may have to consider the timing of your shots and not just go by the percentage, as enemies can duck behind cover to avoid damage. The only real downside to combat overall that I've found is some awkward game stuttering when wielding any automatic weapon, which makes them relatively unusable in combat. The enemies that you'll be fighting mostly come from Fallout 4 as well. New things like the mole miners and the scorched come in to replace the lack of human enemies. There's also a new apex predator called a Scorch Beast that blasts you from the sky and summons enemies to fight alongside it. though my personal favorites are the new cryptid monsters. Not so much the Grafton monster, Wendigo, or the Snallygaster, who seem to show up on a regular basis, but the more mysterious ones, like the Mothman and the Flatwoods monster, which I've had fun running into by complete chance whilst exploring the forests of Appalachia. The rarity of finding these cryptids makes the encounters with them all that more special. And as far as special things go, thanks to the less scripted enemy spawns, you can sometimes run into interesting combinations of enemies. Like when I found this clash of titans between a Scorch Beast and a Mirelurk Queen, or running into an aggressive Mothman and a Deathclaw, all while I was supposed to be defending an area against Mirelurks. Plus, many locations change which faction has control at any given time, making repeated attacks on an area a little more interesting than Fallout 4, which just repopulated an area with the same enemy type. Tied to these aspects of gameplay is the survival portion of Fallout 76. All weapons and armor now have condition decay, which makes them need repairs after a certain amount of time. These repairs rely on crafting materials that are acquired the same way they were in Fallout 4, and unlike Fallout 3 and New Vegas, you can't combine duplicate items together to repair them, which I think could have led to some interesting choices of, do I scrap an item and get modifications, or do I repair my current weapon to keep using it? You yourself also have decaying food and water meters that need constant upkeep, lest you suffer the negative side effects. You still get food off creatures like Fallout 4, and water can still be drunk from any water source, but both that and raw food ingredients now come with diseases. So choosing not to cook food and boil water can have dire consequences, and don't think you can just hoard your way out of the need for hunting and gathering either. All non-instant food and non-water drinks have time limits before they turn into disease-ridden slop, so you'll need to constantly replenish your food and water stocks. Alongside that is the fact that they all have an assigned weight to them, so you'll need to manage how much to bring, since you may need the extra carry capacity for the other items you wish to hold on to, like weapons, armors, crafting materials, and even ammo, as they all have weight as well. Which brings me to the C.A.M.P system, which is essentially the building system from Fallout 4, but mobile. You can place your camp anywhere that's not already an official location and use it in one of two ways. Place it and use it as a storage facility to hold on to things you might need later and get a free fast travel location as a bonus, or make a permanent base to build and improve upon. The reason that I call these things separate is that while this system is supposed to allow you to move your camp and all its buildings too, the concept doesn't really work out because whatever location you're moving to needs to have a similar ground structure to place your building back down, and that's hardly ever going to happen. So either make a big base you're proud of, or a little one you can move whenever you need to, not both. Alongside these survival aspects is the perk system, which is one of the few things I consider to be a massive improvement over Fallout 4. Gone are the days of leveling up and choosing between getting a perk or increasing a special stat to try and get a perk in the future, as the two are now the same. The new limitation here is that certain perks are only acquirable at higher levels, and the amount of points in a certain stat dictate how many perks of that type you can equip. Otherwise, the system of getting and improving perks remains the same, except that perks aren't permanent. You can freely swap them out at any time, which allow you to change your playstyle at a moment's notice. And while this does mean that you can't equip and use every single perk like Fallout 4, it also means that you can't equip and use every perk like Fallout 4. And yes, by that I mean I see the limitation as an improvement. In Fallout 4, given enough time, you would eventually turn into a perked out god, with all the later perk gains just feeling like you're filling out the board. But this new system makes you choose perks that feel relevant to how you want to play the game, because you only get to equip a certain amount. So what you choose to equip ends up having a much greater significance. As for the perks themselves, you'll see a lot of returning favorites, likely rebalanced to fit the new settings, and with real people replacing the dialogue system, the charisma tree is filled with more cooperative skills, though many are still useful if you're alone. And if the weight limits I just mentioned before are any indication, you're probably going to put plenty of points into strength to increase the load you can carry and decrease the weight of items held. Along with the perks are mutations, which can be randomly gained when being irradiated. These mutations are similar to the way traits worked in the original Fallout games, with odd upsides and downsides depending on what you get. They are easily removable with the Radaway medicine, but if you like your mutation's effect, you may need to really try to hold on to it. As for the locations at Fallout 76, Bethesda went more with how the Elder Scrolls does things and made a variety of different regions to explore. Different types of forests take up most of the map, but there's also darkened swamps, toxic scorched valleys, eerie red bogs, and even a soot-covered mountain created by rampant overmining. From an artistic perspective, it's certainly more impressive than any of the previous Fallout games, but at the same time, it doesn't really give off a post-apocalyptic vibe. I'm still hoping they find a way to cater to both sides, as I'm not really sure which I prefer. And the actual size of the map is quite massive, dotted with even more locations to explore. Thankfully, most buildings aren't isolated into separate loading zones, so you don't spend a lot of time going in and out of them. But the increase in the amount of locations means that a lot of them don't have more fleshed out micro-stories that you'd normally find in prior Fallout games. It'll just be one terminal or one holotape, and that's it. Another downside that's kind of related to the new locations is the fact that fast traveling to one, aside from Vault 76 and your camp base, costs money. I feel like this was implemented as another way to get you to explore the Appalachian Hills like the way the main quest does, but ends up feeling more like a punishment, especially since the drop rate of the post-apocalyptic currency is way down from previous titles. Combined with the fact that the robot vendors have very little money, so you can't trade your way up to riches, means that any major fast travel can take a while to replenish. Especially in the early game, where not only do you have little funds, but the funds you do have are better spent on medical supplies or crafting recipes. The last major feature of Fallout 76 is the nuke system, which, if it wasn't obvious by the name, involves nuking things. After encountering a certain faction within Appalachia, you gain access to nuclear missile silos, which you can then use to bomb any part of the map, aside from the starter area. This bombed area then becomes a high-level zone filled with radiation, strong enemies, and crafting materials that can be used to make the strongest item upgrades. There's something oddly satisfying about listening to the eerie bomb sirens, then watching a nuke blast a portion of the map into a deadly paradise, but Bethesda could have made the blast zone itself much more satisfying. For starters, the area you blast doesn't change geographically. It does get bathed in a faded orange glow, and you can hear a faint noise that I would describe as skittering, but the overall lack of a blast crater or blasted structures feels underwhelming considering you just dropped a nuke on a place. I'm sure that implementing that would have been a huge technical challenge, but it would have been nice nonetheless. One thing I'm sure they could have implemented would have been a few nuke zone specific creatures. You can find things like huge hordes of feral ghouls or level 90 glowing deathclaws, but you fight ghouls and deathclaws all the time. It would have been interesting to see new creatures, or at least familiar creatures with rampant mutations, that would make the fights in the nuke zones different and not just difficult. Ultimately though, I would only call Fallout 76 an okay game. And it's not because of the nuke things, or the quest things, or even the rampant bugs, but instead it goes back to what I said with my multiplayer interactions, which is that Fallout 76 feels like a single-player game with other people in it. I'm not saying that this game should have been just like all the other Fallout titles. The multiplayer experience was Bethesda's whole goal for this game after all, but they should have either done less with the multiplayer, like making the game closer to the older titles with dialogue intact, but had joinable multiplayer missions and things of that nature, or done more with the multiplayer, like having map-wide events that needed everyone's participation, choosing servers based on experience levels or goals to find the type of gameplay you're looking for, and maybe even raids that needed large, coordinated teams to complete. But as it stands now, the addition of multiplayer just waters down the experience into something that's Fallout, but not the best Fallout it could have been.